Tears streamed down Beatrice Wilson's face, her trembling fingers clutching the worn leather shoes that belonged to her 4-year-old daughter, Lucy. She sat on the wooden bench outside Henderson's general store, the afternoon sun beating down on her bowed head as she contemplated how quickly life could change. "Madam," the deep voice startled her, "are you all right?" Beatrice looked up, squinting against the sunlight to see a tall figure standing before her. His face was partially shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, but she could make out concerned blue eyes and a strong jawline dusted with stubble. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though the catch in her voice betrayed her. The stranger gestured to the empty space beside her. "Mind if I sit?" she shrugged, wiping hastily at her tears. The man settled beside her, keeping a respectful distance. He was dressed like most men in Cottonwood Springs' dusty trousers, worn boots, a button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a vest that had seen better days. The gun holstered at his hip marked him as someone who knew the dangers of the territory. "Name's Owen Westfield," he said simply. "Beatrice Wilson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes fell to the small shoes in her hands. "Your child's," fresh tears welled in Beatrice's eyes as she nodded. "My daughter's, Lucy?" Owen's expression softened. "She must be about 4 or 5, 4. Beatrice ran her thumb over the scuffed toe of one shoe. "These are all I have left of her now." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Owen removed his hat and placed it on his knee, revealing sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Mrs. Wilson." "Miss," she corrected quietly. "I never married Lucy's father. He left when I told him I was with child." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes rather than judgment. This town can be hard on folks alone. Beatrice clutched the shoes tighter. "I'm leaving tomorrow. The stagecoach comes at noon. I can't stay here anymore, not with her gone." Her voice broke on the last word. "Where will you go?" He asked. "East, back to my sister in St. Louis." She stared down at the shoes, fresh tears falling. "I should pack these away, but I can't seem to let them go." Owen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful as he watched her. Then he said gently, "You can leave them here for a while." Beatrice looked up, confusion clear in her tear-stained face. "I mean," he clarified, "there's a small church at the edge of town. They have a place for remembrances. Folks leave things there sometimes when they lose someone. It might give you somewhere to visit before you go." "I didn't know about that," Beatrice admitted. "I could show you if you'd like." She hesitated, studying this stranger who'd stopped to comfort her. There was something in his eyes, a kindness, but also a shadow that spoke of his own familiarity with grief. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Owen placed his hat back on his head. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most." He stood and offered her his hand. Sometimes a kindness from a stranger is what gets us through the darkest days. Beatrice looked at his outstretched hand, then back at the small shoes cradled in her lap. She had nothing left to lose. With a deep breath, she took his hand. This was Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1878, a place where life was as harsh as the landscape, where death came too easily and too often. But even here, kindness could bloom like the rare desert flower after rain. As they walked down the dusty main street, neither of them could have imagined how their lives would intertwine in the months ahead, or that from the depths of grief, something beautiful might grow. The small church stood on the outskirts of town, its weathered wooden steeple reaching toward the vast Arizona sky. Behind it, a modest cemetery spread out, markers in various states of disrepair telling silent stories of those who'd settled in this unforgiving land. Beatrice followed Owen around the side of the church to a small alcove where a wooden shelf held various items: a child's wooden horse, a tarnished locket, a man's pocket watch, a faded ribbon. Mementos of lives lost, left behind by those who'd loved them. People leave things here. She asked softly. Owen nodded. Pastor Miller started it years back, said sometimes folks need a place to put their grief when they can't visit a proper grave. Beatrice swallowed hard. There was no grave for Lucy. The fever had taken her so quickly, and with no family plot in Cottonwood Springs. She'd been buried in the paupers section of the cemetery, marked only by a simple wooden cross that would likely weather away before long. "It's peaceful here," she said, looking around at the desert landscape, the red rocks in the distance catching the late afternoon light. "It is," Owen agreed. He stayed a respectful distance away as Beatrice approached the shelf. With trembling hands, she placed Lucy's small shoes among the other remembrances. They looked so new compared to the weathered items surrounding them. Lucy had only worn them a handful of times before the fever came. "She was so proud of these shoes," Beatrice whispered, her fingers lingering on the leather. "Saved up for months to buy them for her. She wore them to church just once before." Her voice trailed off. Owen remained silent, understanding that sometimes presence meant more than words. Beatrice straightened, brushing dust from her simple dress. "Thank you for showing me this place, Mr. Westfield." "Owen," he corrected gently. She nodded. "Owen." As they walked back toward town, the silence between them was companionable rather than awkward. The western sky was beginning to show hints of the spectacular sunset to come, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. "How long have you been in Cottonwood Springs?" Beatrice asked eventually. "About 3 years now," Owen replied. "Came out after the war. Needed open spaces after what I saw back east." Beatrice nodded. Many men had headed west after the war between the states, seeking to escape memories or to find opportunity in the expanding frontier. "And you, Miss Wilson, what brought you here?" Beatrice sighed. "Hope, I suppose. After my parents died, I had few options in St. Louis. My sister was married with children of her own. When I found myself with child and abandoned, the idea of a fresh start appealed." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I thought the West would be kinder somehow." "It can be hard," Owen acknowledged, "but there's something honest about the hardship here. The land doesn't pretend to be gentle." They reached the center of town, where the single street was lined with the essential businesses of frontier life: the general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office, a small hotel, and a few other establishments. "Where are you staying?" Owen asked. "Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Beatrice replied, gesturing toward a 2-story building at the end of the street. "She let me keep my room even after." She couldn't finish the sentence. Owen nodded. "She's a good woman." They stopped in front of the boarding house. Beatrice turned to face him, suddenly awkward. "Thank you again, Mr. Owen. I appreciate your kindness today." "Think nothing of it." He tipped his hat to her. "If you need anything before you leave tomorrow, I work at the livery stable just yonder." He pointed down the street to where several horses could be seen in a corral. Beatrice nodded, though she couldn't imagine what else she might need from this man who was already kinder than most she'd encountered in Cottonwood Springs. "Good evening, Miss Wilson." With another tip of his hat, Owen turned and walked away, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Beatrice watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. For the first time since Lucy's death 3 weeks ago, she'd spent an hour not consumed by grief. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it felt significant. With a deep breath, she turned and entered the boarding house, ready to face the task of packing her meager belongings for tomorrow's departure. The stage was late. Beatrice sat on a bench outside the Wells Fargo office, her single trunk at her feet, as the noon hour came and went. The few other passengers waiting had begun to grumble, some drifting off to get refreshment at the hotel restaurant. "Stage is running at least 2 hours behind," the agent announced, stepping out of his office. "Messenger just rode in, had some trouble with a wheel about 20 miles back. They're fixing it now but won't be here until mid-afternoon." Beatrice sighed, shifting uncomfortably on the hard bench. She hadn't eaten since early morning, having been too anxious about her departure to think of food. Now her stomach growled in protest of its neglect. "Miss Wilson." She looked up to see Owen Westfield approaching, his hat in his hands. He'd clearly made an effort. With his appearance, his shirt was clean, his hair combed neatly. "Mr. Westfield," she acknowledged with a nod. "I heard the stage is delayed," he said, gesturing to the empty street where the coach should have been. "I thought you might like to get some dinner while you wait." Beatrice hesitated. Dining with a man she barely knew wasn't proper, but then again, nothing about her life had followed the rules of propriety. Besides, she was leaving town. What did it matter what anyone thought? "That would be kind," she admitted. "I am rather hungry." Owen's face brightened with a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger, less weathered by the hardships of frontier life. "The hotel dining room serves a decent meal," he offered, gesturing across the street. "Let me just tell the agent where I'll be," Beatrice said, rising from the bench. After ensuring her trunk would be watched, she joined Owen for the short walk to the hotel. The dining room was relatively quiet, the lunch rush having ended. They were seated at a small table near a window that looked out onto the street. Beatrice noticed a few curious glances from other diners but chose to ignore them. "I hope I'm not keeping you from your work," she said as they settled at the table. Owen shook his head. "I have the afternoon off. Mr. Fleming's son is learning the business, so he's minding the stable today." A waitress brought them water and informed them of the day's offerings: beef stew or fried chicken with potatoes and greens. "The stew, please," Beatrice requested, suddenly aware of how hungry she truly was. "Make that too," Owen added. As the waitress departed, a slightly awkward silence fell between them. Beatrice found herself studying Owen more carefully than she had the day before. In the clear light of the dining room, she could see that his blue eyes had flecks of gray in them, and fine lines at the corners suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor might indicate. She guessed him to be in his early 30s, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 26 years. "Have you always worked with horses?" she asked, breaking the silence. Owen took a sip of water before answering. "Not always. My family had a small farm in Kentucky before the war. I learned about horses there, but I didn't work with them professionally until I came west." "You fought in the war." It was a delicate question in these years after the conflict that had torn the nation apart. "Union cavalry," he confirmed with a nod. "Enlisted in '62 when I was 18. Saw more than I cared to by the time it ended." Beatrice nodded, understanding his earlier comment about needing open spaces after what he'd witnessed. "And you've been in Cottonwood Springs since then?" she prompted. "Not directly, wandered for a while after the war ended. Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some scouting for the Army." He shrugged. "Landed here 3 years back when my horse came up lame. Mr. Fleming needed help, so I stayed." Their food arrived, steaming bowls of hearty stew accompanied by thick slices of bread. Beatrice realized how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. Since Lucy's illness, food had been an afterthought, something she forced herself to consume only when necessary. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Owen spoke again. "May I ask where in St. Louis your sister lives?" "Carondelet," Beatrice replied. "It's south of the city proper. Her husband works for the railroad." Owen nodded. "Good steady work, that." "Yes," Beatrice agreed. "They've invited me to stay until I can find my footing. My sister suggested I might find work as a seamstress." She looked down at her bowl. "I'm quite handy with a needle." "I noticed the fine stitching on your daughter's shoes," Owen said quietly. "Did you make those?" Beatrice shook her head. "No, though I did add the flowers on the toes." She loved flowers. A lump formed in her throat, making it difficult to continue eating. Owen seemed to sense her distress. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you." "It's all right," Beatrice assured him, blinking back tears. "Everything reminds me of her. That's partly why I need to leave." "Too many memories here." Owen nodded in understanding. Memory can be a blessing and a curse. Something in his tone made Beatrice wonder what memories haunted him, but she didn't ask. They finished their meal with lighter conversation, Owen telling her about a particularly stubborn mule at the livery. Beatrice sharing a story about the peculiar hat Mrs. Patterson had worn to church the previous Sunday. When they finished eating, Owen insisted on paying for the meal despite Beatrice's protests. "Please," he said, "consider it a parting gift." As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Beatrice was surprised to see dark clouds gathering in the western sky. The clear morning had given way to what looked like an approaching storm. "That doesn't look promising," Owen remarked, following her gaze. "Those summer storms can be fierce." They returned to the Wells Fargo office where the agent confirmed their fears. "Just got word the stage is delayed further," he announced to the waiting passengers. "Storm's kicked up something fierce out on the flats. They're holing up at the way station until it passes." "When do you expect them?" an irritated businessman demanded. The agent shrugged. "Tomorrow morning at the earliest if the weather clears overnight." A collective groan rose from the waiting passengers. Beatrice felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. She'd steeled herself for departure, had said her goodbyes to this place, including her final farewell to Lucy's shoes at the church that morning. The delay felt like salt in an open wound. "You all right?" Owen asked quietly as the other passengers dispersed, grumbling about finding accommodations for the night. "I suppose I'll have to see if Mrs. Patterson has a room available," Beatrice sighed. "I'd given up mine this morning." Owen hesitated, then said, "If she doesn't, the hotel usually has space." Beatrice nodded, trying not to think about the cost. Her funds were limited, carefully calculated to get her to St. Louis with a small amount to spare. An unexpected night at the hotel hadn't been part of her budget. "I'll help you with your trunk," Owen offered, already reaching for the heavy container. They made their way back to the boarding house, the wind picking up noticeably as they walked. By the time they reached Mrs. Patterson's, the first large drops of rain were beginning to fall. The news wasn't good. "I'm sorry, Beatrice," Mrs. Patterson said, genuine regret in her voice. "I've already promised your room to the new schoolteacher arriving tomorrow." "I understand," Beatrice said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Thank you anyway, Mrs. Patterson." As they stepped back onto the porch, the skies opened up. Rain came down in sheets, turning the dusty street to mud within minutes. Thunder cracked overhead, causing Beatrice to jump. "We should get to the hotel before it gets worse," Owen shouted over the downpour, picking up her trunk again. They ran through the deluge, Beatrice holding her skirts above the rapidly forming puddles. By the time they reached the hotel, they were both soaked through. The lobby was crowded with other stranded travelers, and Beatrice's heart sank as she heard the clerk tell a man there were no rooms available. "What now?" she asked Owen, water dripping from her bonnet. Owen looked around, clearly thinking. "I have a small house at the edge of town," he said finally. "It's not much, but there's a spare room. You'd be welcome to it for the night." Beatrice stared at him, aware that accepting such an offer would be considered scandalous by most standards. Staying in an unmarried man's home, even with separate rooms, was simply not done, yet what were her alternatives? Sleep in the lobby of the crowded hotel, spend a night in the stagecoach office. "People will talk," she said quietly. Owen's expression was serious. "Miss Wilson, you're leaving town tomorrow, and with respect, after what you've been through, does it really matter what people say?" Beatrice considered his words. He was right, she had already faced the worst thing imaginable. The whispers of townspeople she'd never see again paled in comparison to the loss of her child. "I accept your offer," she said firmly. "Thank you." Relief flickered across Owen's face. "My wagon's at the livery. We'll need to make a dash for it." They did just that, running through the torrential rain to the stable where a small covered wagon waited. Owen loaded her trunk into the back and helped Beatrice onto the seat beside him. With a flick of the reins, they set off through the storm. Owen's house was indeed at the edge of town, a modest structure set back from the road with a small corral and barn behind it. It was simple but well maintained, with a covered porch that offered shelter from the rain as they hurried inside. "It's not much," Owen said apologetically as he lit a lamp, revealing a tidy main room with a stone fireplace, a small table with chairs and simple furnishings. "It's lovely," Beatrice assured him, genuinely impressed by the cleanliness and order. Many bachelor dwellings she'd glimpsed were far less inviting. Owen busied himself starting a fire in the hearth while Beatrice stood awkwardly, water pooling around her feet. When the flames caught, he straightened and seemed to notice her discomfort for the first time. "You're soaked through," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Let me find you something dry to wear while your things dry out." He disappeared into one of the two doors off the main room, returning moments later with a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that had been cut down. These are old, he explained, holding them out to her. The trousers might be big, but there's a belt. It's not proper, I know, but it's better than catching your death of cold. Beatrice accepted the clothes, too wet and uncomfortable to worry about propriety. Thank you. The bedroom's through there, Owen said, pointing to the second door. I'll bring your trunk in so you can get whatever else you need. While Owen went back out into the storm, Beatrice entered the small bedroom. Like the main room, it was simple but tidy, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a washstand with a basin and pitcher. A framed daguerreotype on the wall caught her attention, a family portrait showing a young man she recognized as Owen, along with an older couple and a younger girl, perhaps 16 or 17. She changed quickly, grateful for the dry clothing even if it was improper for a woman to wear men's garments. The trousers were indeed too large, but the belt helped, and she rolled up the cuffs to keep from tripping. The flannel shirt was soft from many washings and smelled faintly of soap. When she emerged, Owen had returned with her trunk and was busy in the small kitchen area, his back to her. He had removed his wet coat and boots, but was still in his damp shirt and trousers. I'm making coffee, he said without turning. Thought it might warm us up. That sounds wonderful, Beatrice replied, self-consciously tugging at the shirt that hung loosely on her frame. When Owen turned with 2 steaming cups, he paused, seeing her in his clothes. Something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. I apologize for the improper attire, she said, feeling her cheeks warm. No apology needed, he assured her, handing her a cup. Practicality trumps convention in weather like this. They sat at the small table, the rain drumming on the roof above them. Through the window, lightning occasionally illuminated the landscape, followed by the rumble of thunder. Will your horses be all right? Beatrice asked, thinking of the animals in the nearby barn. They're fine, Owen assured her. The barn is sturdy and they're used to storms. They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, the situation perhaps catching up with them both. Beatrice was acutely aware that she was alone in a man's home, wearing his clothes, something that would have been unthinkable just a day ago. Tell me about your daughter, Owen said suddenly, breaking the silence. If you don't mind talking about her, that is. Beatrice was surprised by the request. Most people avoided mentioning Lucy, as if speaking of her might somehow amplify Beatrice's grief. She was 4, Beatrice began hesitantly. She had my brown hair but blue eyes like her father, she was. Her voice caught, she was curious about everything, always asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds go at night? That sort of thing. Owen smiled encouragingly. She sounds like a clever child. She was, Beatrice agreed, a small smile forming despite her sadness, and kind. She once gave her only candy stick to a crying boy at the general store. The memory warmed her heart even as it ached with loss. She loved stories. I'd read to her every night. What was her favorite? Owen asked. The 3 bears, Beatrice replied without hesitation. She loved the part about the porridge being too hot or too cold. Owen chuckled. I remember that story from when I was a boy. The conversation flowed more easily after that, with Beatrice sharing stories of Lucy's short life, her first steps, her favorite games, the imaginary friend she'd invented named Mr. Whiskers, who was supposedly a cat with human features. Thank you, Beatrice said finally, after a particularly amusing anecdote about Lucy trying to catch raindrops on her tongue had them both laughing. Most people change the subject when I mention her. People don't know what to say about grief, Owen said, his expression growing thoughtful. They're afraid of saying the wrong thing, so they say nothing at all. You seem to know better, Beatrice observed. Owen was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his empty cup. I lost my sister during the war, he said finally. Typhoid, she was 18. When I came home afterward, it seemed like everyone had forgotten her. No one spoke her name. It was like she'd never existed. His jaw tightened at the memory. That was almost worse than losing her. I'm sorry, Beatrice said softly. What was her name? Olivia, Owen replied, a sad smile touching his lips. My parents called her Livy. That's a beautiful name. She was a beautiful soul, Owen said. Sounds like your Lucy was too. Beatrice nodded, feeling a connection with this man who understood what so many did not. That sometimes, speaking of those lost was a comfort rather than a wound. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside Owen's small house, a quiet understanding had formed between them. They talked late into the evening, sharing more stories, some sad, some joyful, about their lives and the people they'd loved and lost. As the hour grew late, Owen insisted Beatrice take the bedroom while he would sleep on a pallet by the fire. Despite her protests that she was imposing enough without taking his bed, Owen was firm. "My mother would come back to haunt me if I let a lady sleep on the floor," he said with a smile that reached his eyes, creating those crinkles she'd noticed earlier. Beatrice reluctantly agreed, taking her nightgown and robe from her trunk before retiring to the bedroom. As she lay in Owen's bed, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, she was struck by the strange turn of events that had led her here. Yesterday, she'd been consumed by grief and the urgent need to leave Cottonwood Springs. Tonight, for the first time since Lucy's death, she'd laughed. She'd shared memories of her daughter without being overwhelmed by sorrow. It was, she realized, because of the kind man sleeping in the next room, a man who'd stopped to help a crying stranger and offered comfort when she needed it most. With that comforting thought, Beatrice drifted into the most peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks. The storm passed sometime in the night, and Beatrice awoke to sunlight streaming through the small window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back: the delayed stagecoach, the storm, Owen's offer of shelter. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which had dried overnight, and tidied her hair as best she could without her usual implements. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Owen already up and about, stoking the fire and preparing what smelled like breakfast. "Good morning," he greeted her, a warm smile lighting his features. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time," Beatrice admitted. "Thank you for your hospitality." "It was my pleasure," Owen replied, returning to the small stove where bacon sizzled in a cast iron skillet. "Thought you might like a hot meal before your journey." "That's very kind," Beatrice said, moving to the table which had already been set with plates and cups. "Is there anything I can do to help? You could pour the coffee if you like," Owen suggested, nodding toward a pot on the stove. They worked in companionable silence, moving around the small kitchen with surprising ease, as if they'd done this dance many times before. When the meal was ready, bacon, eggs, and biscuits that Owen apologetically admitted were left over from the day before they sat down together. "The stage should be arriving by mid-morning," Owen said as they ate. "I can take you back to town whenever you're ready." Beatrice nodded, a strange reluctance settling in her chest at the thought of leaving. After weeks of desperate desire to escape Cottonwood Springs and its painful memories, she found herself oddly hesitant now that the moment was approaching. "I visited the church again yesterday morning," she said after a moment, "to see Lucy's shoes one last time." Owen looked up from his plate, his expression gentle. "I'm glad you had that chance." "I am too." Beatrice took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I've been so focused on leaving, on running from the pain, that I haven't allowed myself to remember the good times. Last night, talking about Lucy, it helped. I'm glad," Owen said simply. "You've been very kind to a stranger," Beatrice continued, meeting his gaze across the table. "I won't forget it." Something flickered in Owen's blue-gray eyes, a question perhaps, or a thought unspoken. But he only nodded and returned to his breakfast. When they'd finished eating and cleared away the dishes, Beatrice collected her few belongings from the bedroom and prepared to leave. As Owen loaded her trunk into the wagon, she took one last look around the small house that had provided such unexpected sanctuary. The ride to town was quieter than their conversations the previous evening. Beatrice found herself stealing glances at Owen's profile as he guided the horses through puddles left by the storm. There was a strength to his features, a steadiness that she found reassuring. In town, they found several passengers already waiting at the Wells Fargo office. The agent confirmed that the stage was expected within the hour. "I should wait here," Beatrice said as Owen set her trunk down among the other luggage. Of course, he agreed, though he made no move to leave. Instead, he stood awkwardly, hat in hands, as if there was something more he wanted to say. "Miss Wilson, Beatrice," he began finally, "I know you have your reasons for leaving, and I respect that, but, she prompted when he hesitated. "But I've enjoyed your company these past 2 days," he said simply. More than I expected to enjoy anyone's company in a long while. Beatrice felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I've enjoyed yours as well, Owen." He smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "Would you permit me to write to you?" In St. Louis, the request surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something growing between them, a connection formed through shared grief and unexpected kindness. "I would like that," she said, surprised at how much she meant it. Owen's smile widened. "I'm not much of a letter writer, but I'd try my best." "I'm sure your best would be just fine," Beatrice assured him. A commotion down the street interrupted them. The stagecoach was approaching, the team of 6 horses kicking up dust as they pulled the vehicle into town. "That's your ride," Owen said, a note of regret in his voice. Beatrice nodded, suddenly uncertain. The past weeks had been a blur of grief and desperate plans to escape. Now, standing on the verge of departure, she wondered if she was making the right choice. "Owen," she began, not quite knowing what she wanted to say. The stagecoach pulled up to the office, the driver calling out for passengers to board. The other travelers began to gather their belongings, creating a flurry of activity around them. "You'd better get your seat," Owen said, lifting her trunk to carry it to the coach. "It's a long journey to St. Louis." Beatrice followed him, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. As the driver loaded her trunk onto the roof of the coach, she turned to face Owen one last time. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Owen took her hand in his, the touch sending an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Safe travels, Beatrice. I'll write soon." She nodded, unable to find more words. With a final squeeze of his hand, she turned and climbed into the coach, finding a seat by the window. As the other passengers boarded and settled, she looked out to see Owen still standing there, watching. The driver called out, the whip cracked, and the coach lurched forward. Beatrice kept her eyes on Owen until the coach rounded a bend in the road, taking him out of sight. She settled back against the hard leather seat, surrounded by strangers embarking on their own journeys. Ahead lay St. Louis, her sister's family, a chance to rebuild her life away from the memories that had haunted her in Cottonwood Springs. Yet as the miles began to pass beneath the wheels of the coach, Beatrice found her thoughts returning not to St. Louis and the future, but to Cottonwood Springs and Owen Westfield. To small shoes placed on a shelf in a church alcove. To conversations by firelight during a storm. To understanding blue-gray eyes that had seen their own share of sorrow. She had left to escape pain, but in doing so, had she perhaps left behind something unexpected? Something that, given time, might have helped heal her broken heart. The journey to St. Louis took nearly 2 weeks, a grueling succession of long days in the jolting stagecoach and nights in way-station lodgings of varying quality. By the time Beatrice arrived at her sister Charlotte's neat home in Carondelet, she was exhausted, dusty, and more uncertain than ever about her decision to leave Arizona territory. Charlotte welcomed her with open arms, as did her husband Robert and their 3 children, 2 boys of 10 and 8, and a girl of 6. The house was comfortable, the neighborhood respectable, the routine of family life soothing in its predictability. Yet as days turned to weeks, Beatrice found herself struggling to settle into this new life. She helped with the children, assisted Charlotte with household duties, and even began taking in small sewing jobs from neighbors to contribute to the family income. But at night, alone in the small room that had been cleared for her use, her thoughts inevitably drifted back to Cottonwood Springs, to Lucy's small shoes on the church shelf, to Owen's gentle understanding. A month after her arrival, the first letter came. Beatrice recognized Owen's handwriting immediately on the envelope, though they'd exchanged only addresses, not correspondence. She took the letter to the small garden behind the house, seeking privacy to read his words. "Dear Beatrice, I hope this letter finds you well and settled in St. Louis. I apologize for the delay in writing. As I warned, I am not practiced in correspondence. The written word does not come as naturally to me as working with horses or mending a fence, but I promised to write, and so I am attempting to fulfill that promise. Cottonwood Springs continues much as it was when you left. Mrs. Patterson has her new boarder, a young schoolteacher named Miss Grant who wears spectacles and speaks with an Eastern accent that has the saloon men practicing their grammar. The summer heat has settled in fully, making everyone move a bit slower, especially in the afternoons. I visit the church alcove occasionally. Your daughter's shoes remain where you placed them. Sometimes I find myself talking to them, or rather, to the memory of the little girl who once wore them. I hope you don't mind. From your stories, I think Lucy would have enjoyed knowing people remembered her. I find myself thinking often of our conversations during the storm. It has been a long time since I spoke so openly about Livy or the war. Thank you for listening and for sharing your own stories of Lucy. There is comfort in being understood, isn't there? If you wish to write back, I would welcome your letter. If not, I understand. Either way, I hope you find the peace you were seeking when you boarded that stagecoach. Sincerely, Owen Westfield. Beatrice read the letter twice, her heart quickening at his mention of visiting Lucy's shoes. The image of this tall, serious man speaking to her daughter's memory brought unexpected tears to her eyes. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the small desk in her room and penned her reply. Dear Owen, your letter was a welcome surprise. I am indeed settled in St. Louis, though settled perhaps suggests more permanence than I feel. My sister and her family have been most welcoming, and the children are a joy, though they sometimes remind me painfully of what I have lost. I am glad to hear that Lucy's shoes remain in their place. Far from minding that you speak to them, I find comfort in knowing someone besides myself remembers her. Sometimes I fear that as time passes, the memory of her will fade, not just for me but for the world. Your visits to the church alcove assure me that she is not forgotten. St. Louis is much changed from when I left it years ago. The city grows ever larger and the pace of life is so different from the territory. There are advantages, of course, more conveniences, better established society, fewer dangers. Yet I find myself missing the vast open skies of Arizona and the honesty of life there, as you once described it. I have begun taking in sewing to earn my keep. The ladies here are most particular about their garments, which keeps me busy with fine stitching and alterations. The work is good for me, I think. It occupies my hands and sometimes even my mind. I, too, think often of our conversations during the storm. It was the first time since Lucy's passing that I spoke of her without being overwhelmed by grief. There was something healing in sharing stories with someone who understood the nature of loss. I would welcome more letters, if you are so inclined. Your first effort suggests you underestimate your skill with the written word. With warm regards, Beatrice Wilson. She sealed the letter, feeling lighter somehow for having written it. The connection to Owen and through him to Cottonwood Springs and Lucy's memorial felt like a lifeline to something important she'd left behind. Over the following months, their correspondence continued. Owen wrote of life in the small town, the summer heat giving way to autumn crispness, the comings and goings of travelers, the small dramas that made up daily life in a frontier community. Beatrice shared stories of her new routines in St. Louis, her growing sewing business, her observations of city life after years in the territory. But between the lines of their letters grew something deeper, a sharing of thoughts, beliefs, and feelings that went beyond mere news. Owen confided his dreams of someday having his own horse ranch. Beatrice admitted her struggles with fitting into St. Louis society after her years away. They exchanged childhood memories, favorite books, thoughts on everything from politics to religion. By Christmas, Beatrice found herself rushing to the door whenever the post arrived, eager for Owen's familiar handwriting. Charlotte noticed, of course, and finally confronted her sister one evening as they sat mending by the fire after the children were in bed. "This Mr. Westfield," Charlotte began, her needle flashing in the firelight. "You seem quite fond of him." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. He's a kind man who showed me compassion when I most needed it. And now you've been corresponding for months, Charlotte observed. Is there something more developing there? I don't know, Beatrice admitted, setting down her sewing. We've only known each other a few days in person. The rest has been through letters. Letters can reveal a person's character as surely as face-to-face meetings, Charlotte said wisely. Sometimes more so, as people are often more honest on paper than they are in person. Beatrice considered this. It was true that she and Owen had shared thoughts and feelings in their correspondence that might have taken much longer to reveal in person. I care for him, she acknowledged finally. But my life is here now, Charlotte studied her sister's face. Is it? You've been here 6 months, Bea, and still you speak of St. Louis as if it's a temporary stop rather than your home. Beatrice had no answer for that. The truth was, despite her comfortable life with Charlotte's family, she had never fully committed to making St. Louis her permanent residence. Some part of her had remained in Arizona territory, lingering near a small shelf in a church alcove where tiny shoes sat in remembrance. In January, a letter arrived that changed everything. Owen's handwriting seemed more hurried than usual, less carefully formed. Dear Beatrice, I hope this letter finds you well. I write with news that may seem sudden, though it has been forming in my mind for some time. Mr. Fleming has decided to sell the livery stable and return east to be near his daughter, who is expecting his first grandchild. He has offered me the opportunity to purchase the business. It would mean taking on debt, but the stable is profitable, and with hard work, I believe I could make a success of it. This opportunity has forced me to consider my future more carefully than I have in years. Since the war, I have lived somewhat adrift, taking each day as it came without much thought for what lay ahead. Now I find myself making plans, considering possibilities I had set aside. Among those possibilities, Beatrice, is you. I know we shared only a brief time together in person, yet I feel I have come to know your heart through your letters. I find myself reading and rereading your words, hearing your voice in my mind as clearly as if you were seated across from me. I am not asking for any commitment. I would never presume to intrude upon the new life you have built in St. Louis, but I would like to know if there might be a chance, however small, that you could consider returning to Cottonwood Springs someday. Not to the place of painful memories, but perhaps to build new ones. I understand if this is too forward or if your answer must be no. I will value your friendship regardless. Yours sincerely, Owen. Beatrice's hands trembled as she finished reading. Owen's words echoed questions that had been forming in her own heart over these months of correspondence, questions about home and belonging, about grief and healing, about the possibility of new beginnings. She took the letter to her room, sitting by the window that overlooked the street. St. Louis spread before her, a city of opportunity and established comforts. Her sister's family offered security and connection. Her sewing business was growing steadily. Yet something was missing, something she'd glimpsed briefly in a small house on the edge of a frontier town, during a storm that had changed the course she thought her life would take. That night, Beatrice wrote the most difficult letter of their correspondence. Dear Owen, your news about the livery stable is wonderful. I believe you would make a great success of such an enterprise, given your knowledge and care for horses and your responsible nature. As for the other matter in your letter, the possibility of my return to Cottonwood Springs, I confess it has stirred thoughts that have been growing in my own heart these past months. When I left Arizona, I was running from grief, seeking escape from memories too painful to bear. I thought distance would heal the wound of Lucy's loss. In some ways, perhaps it has. Yet I find that in leaving so hastily, I may have abandoned not only painful memories, but the opportunity to create new ones in a place where part of my heart remains. That said, I cannot simply return based on a few days' acquaintance and months of letters, however meaningful they have been to me. My decision to leave was made in haste and grief. Any decision to return must be made with clearer eyes. Therefore, I propose a middle path. My sister's family will be traveling to Kansas City in April for her husband's business. I could extend that journey westward, perhaps stopping in Cottonwood Springs to see for myself whether it is truly a place I could call home again, and to determine in person whether what has grown between us in these letters might flourish face to face. I make no promises beyond this visit. I hope you can understand my caution, even as I acknowledge the feelings that have developed through our correspondence. With affection, Beatrice. As winter gave way to spring, Beatrice's plans took shape. Charlotte was supportive, if concerned, about her sister's potential return to the place that held such painful memories. Robert arranged for Beatrice to travel with a reputable family heading west after their Kansas City business was concluded. Owen's reply to her proposal had been immediate and warm. He understood her caution and welcomed the opportunity to see her again, regardless of what she might ultimately decide. "I ask only that you come with an open heart," he wrote. "The rest will reveal itself in time." April arrived with warming temperatures and new greenery throughout the Mississippi Valley. Beatrice packed carefully for her journey practical clothes for travel, a few of her better dresses for her stay in Cottonwood Springs, and one special item: a small piece of the blue ribbon that had adorned Lucy's favorite dress, carefully preserved since her daughter's passing. The journey west was long but less arduous than her eastward trip had been. Traveling in spring rather than summer made for more comfortable days, and knowing what to expect of stagecoach travel allowed her to prepare accordingly. Still, as the miles passed beneath the coach wheels, Beatrice's anxiety grew. What if the connection she'd felt with Owen existed only in letters? What if returning to Cottonwood Springs only reopened wounds that had begun to heal? Yet beneath the anxiety lay a current of something else: anticipation, hope. The sense that she was moving toward something important rather than merely running from pain. The stagecoach crested a hill, and suddenly the familiar landscape of Cottonwood Springs spread before her: the scattered buildings of the town, the church steeple in the distance, the vast open country beyond. Beatrice's heart quickened at the sight. For better or worse, she had returned to the place where her life had shattered and, perhaps, where it might begin anew. As the coach pulled into town, Beatrice's eyes scanned the small crowd that always gathered for the stage's arrival. And there he was, Owen Westfield, standing a bit apart from the others, his tall figure unmistakable even after nearly a year. When the coach came to a stop, Beatrice waited for the other passengers to descend before gathering her courage and stepping down onto the dusty street of Cottonwood Springs. For a moment, she and Owen simply looked at each other, the physical reality of their presence after months of written words momentarily overwhelming. Then Owen stepped forward, removing his hat. "Welcome back, Beatrice," he said, his voice just as she remembered, deep, steady, with that note of gentleness that had first drawn her to him. "Thank you, Owen," she replied, suddenly shy despite months of intimate correspondence. He smiled then, the expression transforming his face just as it had that day in the hotel dining room. "You're really here," he said, wonder in his tone. "I'm really here," she confirmed. There was an awkward moment as they both seemed uncertain how to proceed, their relationship having developed primarily through letters. The protocols of greeting were unclear. Finally, Owen offered his arm. "May I escort you to Mrs. Patterson's? I've arranged a room for you there." Beatrice placed her hand on his arm, the contact sending a small thrill through her despite the layers of clothing between them. That would be lovely. As they walked through town, Beatrice was struck by how little had changed in the months she'd been away. The same buildings lined the main street, the same types of people went about their business. Yet her perception had shifted. This was no longer just the place where she had lost Lucy, but also the place where she had met Owen, where kindness had found her at her lowest moment. Mrs. Patterson welcomed Beatrice warmly, showing her to a comfortable room that looked out over the main street. "It's good to see you again, my dear," the older woman said, "though I confess I'm surprised by your return." "So am I in some ways," Beatrice admitted. After settling in and freshening up from her journey, Beatrice met Owen for dinner at the hotel dining room, the same place they'd shared a meal the day of the delayed stagecoach. This time, however, there was no rushing to depart, no storm threatening on the horizon. They had time. "The livery business is going well," Owen told her as they enjoyed their meal. "Fleming left it in good shape, and I've managed to increase our boarding numbers by offering better rates than the stable in Junction City." "That's wonderful," Beatrice said, genuinely pleased for his success. "And your plans for eventually having your own horse ranch, still in my thoughts," Owen admitted. "But the livery is a good first step. It's teaching me about the business side of things." Their conversation flowed easily, much as it had during that stormy night in Owen's house. They spoke of the topics they'd covered in their letters, books they'd read, news from around the country, the small happenings of daily life. Yet there was an added dimension to speaking face to face, the ability to see expressions change, to hear the nuances in tone, to feel the connection that had grown between them strengthen with physical presence. After dinner, as twilight softened the harsh lines of the frontier town, Owen asked, "Would you like to visit the church?" Beatrice hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, I think I'm ready for that now." They walked slowly through town and out toward the small church at its edge. The evening was mild, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun set behind distant mountains. When they reached the church, Owen led her around to the alcove where the shelf of remembrances stood. Beatrice's breath caught when she saw Lucy's shoes, still sitting where she'd placed them nearly a year before. They looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, yet they were still there, a tangible reminder of her daughter's brief life. "They're still perfect," she whispered, reaching out to touch the soft leather. "I've kept an eye on them," Owen said quietly, "made sure they were safe." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes, but they weren't the desperate, consuming tears of grief that had overwhelmed her when last she stood in this spot. These were gentler, sad, yes, but mingled with gratitude for the man who had watched over this small memorial to her child. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him, "for remembering her." Owen's expression was solemn. "I meant what I wrote. I've come to know her through your stories. She matters to me because she matters to you." In that moment, Beatrice understood something fundamental about healing. It didn't mean forgetting or leaving behind, but rather finding ways to carry memories forward into a new chapter of life. Lucy would always be part of her, just as Owen's sister Livy would always be part of him. Their losses had shaped them but need not define their futures. "I'd like to tell you more about her," Beatrice said, "not just in letters but in person if I stay." "And will you?" Owen asked, the question gentle but direct. "Stay?" Beatrice looked at the small shoes, then back at Owen's face, kind, patient, hopeful. "I think I might," she said. "Not just because of you, though you're a significant part of it, but also because I've realized that running from grief doesn't heal it. I need to make peace with this place, with these memories." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "However long it takes," he said, "I'll be here." The following days fell into a gentle rhythm as Beatrice reacquainted herself with Cottonwood Springs. She visited old acquaintances, walked familiar streets, and spent time with Owen when his work at the livery allowed. They rode out to see the surrounding countryside, picnicked by a creek where wildflowers were beginning to bloom, and spent evenings in conversation that deepened their understanding of each other. A week into her visit, Owen invited her to dinner at his house, the first time she'd been there since that stormy night nearly a year before. He'd made improvements to the small dwelling, adding curtains to the windows, a rocking chair by the fire, and bookshelves filled with volumes they discussed in their letters. "You've been busy," Beatrice observed as he showed her the changes. "I've had reason to make a home rather than just a place to sleep," Owen replied, his meaning clear in his eyes. He'd prepared a simple but delicious meal: venison stew, fresh bread from the bakery in town, and an apple pie that he admitted Mrs. Patterson had helped him with. After they ate, they settled by the fire with coffee, the flickering light casting a warm glow over the room. "I've been thinking," Beatrice said after a comfortable silence, "about what it would mean to stay in Cottonwood Springs." Owen set his cup down carefully. "And I'd need to support myself," she continued. "My sewing skills served me well in St. Louis. Perhaps they could do the same here." The town has grown since you left, Owen said. The railroad spur line is bringing more families. There's certainly need for a skilled seamstress. Beatrice nodded, considering. And I'd want my own place, at least at first. As much as I appreciate Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, I've grown accustomed to more independence. There's a small cottage available near the church, Owen offered. 2 rooms, nothing fancy but sound. The widow who owned it passed on last month, and her son in California is looking to sell. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. You seem well informed about available properties. A flush crept up Owen's neck. I may have been making inquiries just in case. The admission warmed her heart. Just in case, she repeated softly. Owen set aside his coffee cup and leaned forward, his expression earnest. Beatrice, I need to be clear about something. I very much hope that you'll choose to stay in Cottonwood Springs. But I want it to be your choice, made for your own reasons, not just for me. What if one of my reasons is you? She asked quietly. Then I'd be honored, he replied. But I don't want to be your only reason. Beatrice considered his words, appreciating the respect they conveyed. When I left last year, I was running from pain, she said slowly. If I stay now, it would be because I've found something worth staying for, not just you, though you're a significant part of it, but also a sense that this place could be home again, in a different way than before. Owen nodded, satisfaction in his expression. That's all I could hope for. The next morning, Beatrice visited the small cottage near the church. It was indeed modest, a main room with a small stove and fireplace, a bedroom just large enough for a bed and chest of drawers, and a tiny lean-to that could serve as a sewing room. But it was clean, with good light, and a small garden patch out back where flowers were already pushing through the soil. Standing in that garden, looking toward the church where Lucy's shoes remained, Beatrice made her decision. She would stay in Cottonwood Springs, not to recapture the past or to erase painful memories, but to build something new that honored what had been while embracing what might yet be. When she told Owen her decision that evening, the joy that spread across his face confirmed she'd made the right choice. They walked together in the soft spring twilight, making plans for her return to St. Louis to collect her belongings and say proper goodbyes before coming back to Arizona territory. There's one more thing, Owen said as they neared Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. He stopped walking and turned to face her, suddenly appearing nervous in a way she'd never seen before. I've been carrying this for some time, waiting for the right moment. From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box. Beatrice's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small pearl. I'm not rushing you, he said quickly. I know you need time to settle here to be sure of your decision, but I wanted you to know my intentions. He took a deep breath. I love you, Beatrice Wilson. I think I began falling in love with you that day outside the general store when you were crying over Lucy's shoes. Tears filled Beatrice's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. And I love you, Owen Westfield. I think perhaps I began falling in love with you when you said I could leave those shoes here for a while, when you understood that I needed both to remember and to find a way forward. Owen took her hand in his. This ring was my mother's. I'd be honored if you would wear it, not right away if you're not ready, but when you are, whether that's weeks or months from now. Beatrice looked at the ring, then at the man holding it. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined finding love again, couldn't have conceived of a future that held joy rather than just endurance. Yet here it was, offered by a man who had reached out to her in her darkest moment. I don't need weeks or months, she said softly. I've had a year of getting to know your heart through your letters. I know what I want. Owen's eyes widened. Are you sure? In answer, Beatrice held out her left hand. With fingers that trembled slightly, Owen slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. It's beautiful, she whispered, admiring how the pearl caught the last light of day. Like you, Owen replied, and then, with a gentleness that spoke of reverence, he leaned down and kissed her for the first time. It was a simple kiss, sweet and filled with promise. When they parted, Beatrice felt as if something long broken inside her had begun to mend, not erasing the past, but creating space for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. They were married 2 months later in the small church, beside the alcove where Lucy's shoes remained. Beatrice wore a dress of pale blue that she'd made herself, with a ribbon in her hair that matched the one she'd placed beside Lucy's shoes, a way of including her daughter in this new beginning. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by friends from town and Charlotte, who had traveled from St. Louis for the occasion. When Owen and Beatrice exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life might bring, there wasn't a dry eye in the church. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Beatrice confessed to her new husband as they danced at their small reception in the town hall. "After Lucy died, it seemed impossible." Owen held her close, his hand warm against her back. "Life has a way of surprising us," he said. "Sometimes with sorrow, but also with joy when we least expect it. Like a stranger offering comfort to a crying woman," Beatrice said with a smile. "Or that woman changing a lonely man's life with her courage and her heart," Owen replied. As they moved across the floor, surrounded by well-wishers, Beatrice felt Lucy's presence not as a painful absence, but as a beloved memory, a part of her that would always remain. And beside her, Owen's strength and gentleness promised a future filled with new memories to create, new joys to discover. In the years that followed, Cottonwood Springs grew from a small frontier town to a thriving community. The railroad brought new residents and opportunities for business. Owen's livery stable prospered, eventually allowing him to purchase land outside town for the horse ranch he'd dreamed of. Beatrice's sewing business flourished, her skilled needlework in demand for everything from everyday garments to wedding dresses. They built a home on the ranch larger than Owen's small house in town, but still modest and welcoming. It had a special room for Beatrice's sewing, a library filled with books they both loved, and eventually, a nursery. Their son James was born 2 years after their marriage, a healthy, robust boy with Owen's blue-gray eyes and Beatrice's gentle smile. As he grew, they told him stories of his sister Lucy, showing him her small shoes that they'd brought home from the church alcove when he was old enough to understand their significance. "She would have loved you," Beatrice told him, watching as 4-year-old James carefully touched the shoes that had once belonged to the sister he would never meet. "Like I love Elizabeth?" he asked, referring to his baby sister, just 6 months old and napping in the cradle nearby. "Just like that," Owen confirmed, his arm around Beatrice's waist as they watched their son. On summer evenings, when the Arizona sky painted itself in spectacular colors, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage across the land, the Westfield family often sat on their porch, watching the children play in the yard. In those moments, Beatrice would sometimes think back to that day outside Henderson's general store when grief had overwhelmed her and a kind stranger had stopped to offer comfort. "What are you thinking about?" Owen would ask, noticing her thoughtful expression. And Beatrice would smile, taking his hand in hers. About how endings sometimes turn out to be beginnings in disguise. For in the end, that was the greatest lesson she had learned, that life's journey continues through both sorrow and joy. And that sometimes, when we think we've reached the end of the road, we discover instead that we're simply turning a corner into a new landscape. One we couldn't have imagined, but that becomes, in time, exactly where we were meant to be. Lucy's shoes remained a treasured keepsake in the Westfield home, a reminder of the past that had brought them to their present happiness. And each year, on Lucy's birthday, Beatrice and Owen would take their children to place flowers at the small memorial they had created for her on their land, not a place of sorrow, but a celebration of a little girl whose brief life had, in its own way, led to the family they now cherished. "Do you ever wonder," Owen asked one evening as they sat together after the children were asleep, "what would have happened if the stagecoach hadn't been delayed that day, if the storm hadn't forced you to stay?" Beatrice considered the question. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember something my grandmother used to say, that life has its own wisdom, greater than our understanding." Owen nodded, pulling her closer. "I'm grateful for that wisdom, whatever form it took." "As am I," Beatrice agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. "As am I." And as the stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Beatrice Wilson Westfield gave thanks for the strange, winding path that had led her from the depths of grief to this moment of profound contentment, for the kindness of a stranger who had become the love of her life, and for the understanding that sorrow, while real and deep, need not be the end of the story. For her story, their story continued to unfold, day by day, season by season, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity to heal, to hope, and to love again.